My hands trembled as I sorted through old photographs. Picture after picture, black and white, color, Polaroid cards, a life laid out in envelopes and albums. Here is Christopher at 5 years old, holding his first microscope. Here he is at 14, with a medal from a science competition. Here we are in white coats at the pharmacy. He's 22, he's just finished pharmacy school, and I could already see him inheriting my life's work. And then it all went to hell. My name is Alfred Higgs. I'm 72 years old, and 5 years ago I lost my son. No, he didn't die then. Physically, he's still out there somewhere, on his damn farm. But for me, he died the moment he betrayed our family traditions, dashed all my hopes, and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Today is a particularly painful day. My head hurts, my joints ache, and the past descends like an octopus, enveloping me in the tentacles of memories. I'm sitting in my living room in Medford, in the same chair where Christopher and I last spoke. Spoke. What an inappropriate word. We yelled at each other. We tore apart the last threads that bound us together. "You're crazy," I said then, clutching the armrests of that very chair as if it could keep me from falling into the abyss. 4 generations of Higgses have been pharmacists. Your great-grandfather started with a medicine cart. Your grandfather built the first pharmacy in Medford, and I turned it into a chain of 7 locations throughout the county. And what are you doing? Giving it all up for some farm? Christopher stood by the fireplace, tall like I was in my youth, but thin, not with my strong, solid build. At 38, he still looked younger than his age. Only in his eyes was there something new, a determination that hadn't been there before. That's what scared me then. "I never promised you I would continue the dynasty." His voice was quiet but firm. "I gave 15 years to the pharmacy business. 15 years, Dad? I did it for you. Now I want to live for myself." "For yourself," I snorted. "Or for this, what's her name? Verity?" I deliberately mispronounced the name of his wife, whom they had married only 6 months ago. A woman I had seen twice but immediately disliked. There was something cold and calculating about her. What could my son, always so open and trusting, have found in her? "Don't bring Verity into this." Christopher's face turned to stone. "This is my decision. Mine alone." "Come on!" I got up from my chair, my arthritic knees creaking in protest. "Before you met her, you never talked about farming. You never pretended to be a shepherd in a meadow. You were a serious man with a career, with a future." Christopher shook his head. I noticed that his chestnut hair, once like mine, was already touched with early gray at the temples. When did that happen? When did we become so estranged that I stopped noticing how my only son was changing? "I always talked about other interests, Dad. You just didn't listen." He paused. "I sold my share of the business to Silas Pettigrew. The papers were signed yesterday." The room spun before my eyes. Silas Pettigrew, my competitor, the man I had fought for 30 years. And now he owns part of my business? "You couldn't have done that," I whispered. "You couldn't have sold your share without my consent." "I could," he replied simply. "Check the contract you drew up yourself. After 10 years with the company, I have the right to dispose of my share as I see fit." 10 years? Yes, there was such a clause. I insisted on it myself, confident that in 10 years Christopher would be even more attached to the business, would become a part of it, just like me. I never thought that clause would come back to haunt me. "You betrayed me," I said, and the words hung in the air like an executioner's axe. "No, Dad." Christopher shook his head. "I just stopped betraying myself." He turned and walked to the door. I couldn't believe he was just going to leave. My son, my boy, my flesh and blood, my pride. No, I couldn't let him go like that. "If you walk out that door, don't come back," I shouted after him. An old, worn-out trick. I used it when Christopher was 16 and came home drunk for the first time. I used it when he was 20 and wanted to drop out of college for some artistic nonsense. I used it dozens of times and it always worked. My son would stop, turn around, and I would see in his eyes the fear of losing his family, of losing me. But this time, Christopher didn't stop. He didn't even turn around. He just said over his shoulder, "Goodbye, Dad," and walked out, closing the door gently behind him. That quiet click of the door closing still haunts my nightmares. After Christopher left, there was a void in my life that I tried to fill with work. More hours at the pharmacy, more meetings with suppliers, more paperwork. In the evenings, whiskey and old Sinatra records that my late wife Helena used to love so much. She died of cancer when Christopher was only 12. I often think, if she were alive, maybe things would have turned out differently. She always knew how to smooth things over between me and my son. In Medford, a town with a population of 20,000, it's impossible not to run into people. I sometimes saw Christopher and Verity from a distance. At the supermarket, at the town fair, once at a restaurant across the street. They never noticed me, or pretended not to notice, and I pretended not to care. Verity, a tall, slender woman with a straight back and a perpetually raised chin. Her hair was the color of a raven's wing, always pulled back into a tight knot at the nape of her neck. Her skin was pale, almost transparent, as if she had never been in the sun. And her eyes, cold gray eyes that seemed to see right through you and find you unworthy of attention. She was an artist, Christopher told me when we first and last met. She painted abstracts and exhibited in small galleries. I looked her up after that meeting. It turned out she was from the old but impoverished Wolf family of New England. Her father had gambled away the family fortune. Her mother had drunk herself to death. A classic story of aristocratic decline. She was 10 years younger than Christopher. They met in Boston at some art exhibition, where my son happened to be, replacing a colleague who had fallen ill at a pharmaceutical conference. Verity struck me as a fortune hunter. But what fortune could Christopher offer her? A share in the family business? A few shares in pharmaceutical companies? An apartment in Medford? Not such an enviable catch. And yet I was sure she was the one who convinced him to give up the pharmacy business. She was the one who put the idea of a farm into his head. She was the one who stole my son. From the very beginning, there was something fake about their relationship. Christopher seemed to be playing a role written by someone else. I remember our first meeting with Verity. It was dinner at Martin's, a restaurant in town. Christopher was nervous, constantly adjusting his tie and laughing too loudly. She sat with her back straight, like a ballerina, and looked at me with a kind of detached curiosity, as if I were an exhibit in a museum. Verity studied art in Paris, Christopher announced proudly. I see, I said, cutting a piece of steak. And what exactly did you study there? Postmodern painting, she said, raising a glass of red wine, and the influence of the socio-political context on visual narratives of the 20th century. I nodded as if it made sense to me. Sounds interesting, I turned to my son. Christopher, did you talk to Jenkins about the new contract with the hospital? Verity smiled slightly, and in that smile I read condescension, as if my interest in the business that had fed my family for 3 generations was something primitive, unworthy of the attention of a cultured person. You probably think art is a waste of time, Mr. Higgs, she asked, not giving Christopher a chance to answer. I think art is wonderful for those who have the time and money for it, I replied. Someone has to do practical things. Someone has to treat people, sell medicine, run businesses. Oh, I completely agree. Her voice was soft, but her gaze was sharp as a scalpel. Some people have to, and some people can afford more. At that moment, I realized she had come to take my son away, and I hated her for it. Christopher's farm was 20 miles from Medford, on the edge of the neighboring county. It was an old place that had once belonged to the Prescott family. The main house, built at the end of the 19th century, had several outbuildings, a large barn, and 15 acres of land. I had no idea what he was going to grow there. Christopher, who grew up in the city, had never shown any interest in farming. He couldn't even keep houseplants alive for more than a month. One day, about a year after our fight, I couldn't resist and drove past the farm, just to see what was going on there. I noticed Christopher in the yard. He was painting the fence. He looked happy, tanned, with grown-out hair, wearing a simple shirt and jeans. So unlike the neat pharmacist in a white coat that he used to be. I didn't stop. I drove past, pressing the gas pedal harder than necessary. When I got home, I drank half a bottle of whiskey and smashed a photo of Christopher and me standing at the entrance to the chain's main pharmacy. Brand new, just opened after renovation. I didn't sleep all night, replaying our argument in my head. I tried to understand where exactly I had gone wrong, how I missed the moment when my son stopped being my son. Maybe it all started much earlier? Maybe when Helena died and, crushed by grief, I sent 12-year-old Christopher to my sister's for a whole month because I couldn't look into his eyes so similar to his mother's? Or when at 16 he brought home a painting he had done in art class, an abstract something, a riot of colors, and was so proud of it, and I just glanced at it and said, if you're going to spend time on things like this, you might as well paint something real. Or maybe when he came to me at 20 with a gleam in his eyes and said he wanted to drop out of pharmacy school and enroll in art school, and I gave him a half-hour lecture on family duty, heritage, practicality, and the futility of chasing ephemeral dreams? I don't know. I don't know when exactly I lost the right to call myself a good father. But 5 years ago when Christopher left, slamming the door behind him, I realized I could no longer pretend that everything was fine, as if I hadn't made any mistakes, as if my demands were only for my son's own good. But even then, my pride wouldn't let me admit it out loud. It wouldn't let me call, come over, ask for forgiveness. The next 4 years passed in a kind of fog: work, loneliness, the illnesses that come with age. My arthritis became more and more painful. My blood pressure fluctuated, and doctors found problems with my heart. Nothing unusual for a man of my age, just a gradual decline. I sometimes heard bits and pieces of information about my son from mutual acquaintances. Some said that Christopher and Verity were growing organic vegetables on their farm. Others said they were breeding some kind of rare chickens. And then one day, I heard that they were holding art workshops on the farm for children from disadvantaged families. It sounded so ridiculous that I laughed right in the face of the person who told me. Abigail Loomis, the owner of the local fabric store, a pharmacist growing organic carrots and teaching troubled teenagers to paint. What a farce. But Abigail insisted that her niece took her son there and that the boy really enjoyed it. Your Christopher has found himself, Alfred, Abigail said, shaking her head. Maybe you should admit that not everyone is destined to follow in their father's footsteps. Maybe you should mind your own business. I snapped, and we never brought up the subject again. Every time I received such bits of information, I felt everything inside me turn upside down. Pride fought with bitterness, anger with longing. I wanted to know more about my son's life, but I couldn't bring myself to take the first step toward reconciliation. Pride had always been my curse. Helena often said that one day it would be my undoing. Perhaps she was right. Years passed, and I gradually came to terms with the idea that my son was doing just fine without me, that our paths had diverged forever. I even began to consider selling the business. Why hold on to a chain of pharmacies if there was no one to pass it on to? Silas Pettigrew, despite our feud, was offering a good price. Maybe it was time to agree, move somewhere in Florida, and live out my days under the palm trees. But deep down, I knew I would never do that. The pharmacies were the last thread connecting me to my son. As long as they existed, there remained a faint hope that one day Christopher would come to his senses, return, and take up the business started by his great-grandfather. A crazy, foolish, senile hope. And while I floundered in this whirlpool of regrets and unfulfilled dreams, my son was living his life with the woman who had taken him away from me, on a farm that had become the embodiment of his rejection of everything I considered important. The ringing of the phone broke the pre-dawn silence. I jumped up in bed, my heart pounding in my throat. The clock showed 5 in the morning. Who could be calling at this hour? Alfred Higgs, I replied hoarsely, clearing my throat. Mr. Higgs? A woman's voice, young, professionally polite. This is Jillian Price from Medford County Hospital. I'm very sorry, but your son, Christopher Higgs. A pause, so short and yet so endless. He was brought to us last night with a heart attack. The doctors did everything they could, but they couldn't save him. I'm so sorry, Mr. Higgs. The world stopped. I stared at the wall opposite the bed, at the pale stain left by a picture Helena had once hung there. The voice on the phone continued to say something, but the words turned into meaningless noise. Mr. Higgs? Can you hear me? Yes, I squeezed out, not recognizing my own voice. How did this happen? According to Mrs. Higgs, your son was working late in the barn. When he didn't come to dinner, she went to check on him and found him unconscious. The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later, but it was too late. It was a massive heart attack. Mrs. Higgs, Verity, she found him. Was she there when... Did Christopher see her face in his final moments? Or did he die alone, on the cold barn floor. "Mr. Higgs," the voice on the line softened. "Are you all right? Maybe someone should come to you?" "No," I replied automatically. "I'm fine. I'll come. Where should I come?" She gave me the address of the morgue. She said the body would not be released yet. A formal examination had to be conducted. Standard procedure in cases of sudden death. After hanging up, I sat motionless, like a stone statue. My son was dead. My boy was only 43 years old and his heart had stopped beating. The man I hadn't spoken to in 5 years was gone forever, taking with him any hope of reconciliation. All the unspoken words, all the unexpressed feelings, all the unspoken regrets. All of this will now remain with me forever, like an indelible stain on my conscience. I forced myself to get up. I mechanically got dressed, washed my face, and combed my hair, as I had done every morning for the last 60 years of my life. On autopilot, I went downstairs, put the kettle on, and got some bread for toast. And then I burst into tears right there in the kitchen, doubled over in pain that was too much for my old worn-out body. An hour later, I was at the morgue. A nurse with a sympathetic look led me into a small room with blue walls. On a metal table lay a body covered with a white sheet. "Are you ready?" she asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. She turned back the sheet, and I saw Christopher's face. So calm, so serene, as if he were just sleeping, only frighteningly pale. I had never seen such whiteness before. "This is my son," I whispered, even though no one had asked me to identify him. "My boy." I reached out and touched his cheek. It was cold as marble. I hadn't seen him up close or spoken to him in 5 years, and now I was standing over his dead body, over a shell from which life had departed, and I realized that I had lost not only my future with him, but also my past. All those years I could have spent with him, getting to know him again, now an adult who had chosen his own path. "I have to go," I said to the nurse. "Of course," she nodded. "The funeral home will contact you about arranging the ceremony." "What about his wife?" "Mrs. Higgs was here early this morning. She said she would contact you about the funeral." Verity was already here. "Of course, she found him. She called the ambulance. She's his wife." I left the morgue on wobbly legs. It was a clear, sunny day with a light spring breeze. Completely inappropriate weather for such grief. Verity's phone call came closer to evening. "Mr. Higgs," her voice sounded muffled, as if she were speaking from underwater. "The funeral is the day after tomorrow at 10 in the morning. Cremation. Christopher didn't want a religious ceremony. I've arranged a small civil memorial service at the city hall." "Cremation?" I asked. "Are you sure that's what Christopher would have wanted? Our family has always buried people in the ground. There's a family plot at Medford Cemetery where his mother, his grandmother, his grandfather are buried. He left written instructions." Her voice became harder. "I'm just carrying out his wishes." I sighed. There was no point in arguing. After all, I didn't know what my son wanted in the last years of his life. I wasn't part of his world. "All right," I said conciliatorily. "Can I help with the arrangements?" "Everything is already taken care of," she snapped. "And yes, I would ask you not to come to the farm. Ever. It was his wish." "His wish?" Disbelief and anger surged within me. "He said that? Don't let my father on the farm after I die?" "Not in those words," she said, a metallic edge to her voice. "But that was the gist of it. I'm sorry, I have to go. I'll see you at the funeral." She hung up without waiting for a response. I sat there clutching the phone in my hand, feeling a familiar fire burning inside me. Rage. It had always been my shield against pain, my weapon against helplessness. I was angry at Verity, at this cruel, absurd prohibition. I was angry at Christopher for dying so early, so suddenly. I was angry at myself for wasting 5 years that I could have spent with my son. But somewhere behind the rage, behind that wall of anger, there was another feeling that I didn't want to admit. Suspicion. Verity was hiding something. Something she didn't want me to see on the farm. Something to do with my son. On the day of the funeral, the weather turned bad. Low gray clouds hung over the city, threatening to spill rain at any moment. Medford City Hall, a small brick building from the 1930s, looked gloomy. There weren't many people inside, about 20. A few pharmacists from my network, Christopher's old school friends, a few strangers, probably farmers from the area. Verity stood by the coffin, which was closed, as she had said, dressed in a simple black dress. Her back was straight as a string, her face an impenetrable mask of grief. I walked over to her, feeling the eyes of the assembled crowd on me. Many of them knew about our quarrel with our son, that we hadn't spoken in 5 years. Verity, I nodded, are you holding up okay? As you can see, she said without even turning to face me. What about the farm? I asked, knowing it was an inappropriate moment, but unable to restrain myself. What are you going to do with it? She finally looked at me, her gray eyes as cold as ice. Sell it, she said emotionlessly, as quickly as possible. Sell it? I couldn't hide my surprise. But Christopher put so much into that place. He worked so hard there. Didn't it become a home for you? It was his place, not mine. She turned away. I've already found a buyer. Everything will be settled by the end of the month. By the end of the month? I thought I had misheard her. So soon? It's only been 2 days since his death, and you've already found a buyer? Verity turned to me, and something like panic flashed in her eyes. But she quickly regained her composure. I've wanted to move to the city for a long time, she said evenly. Christopher knew about it. We had already discussed the possibility of selling. It's just that now I have no reason to stay there. Something in her voice, in her eyes, made me wary. She was lying, I was sure of it. But why? What was it about the farm that made her so eager to get rid of it? My thoughts were interrupted by the priest who began the ceremony. Strange, because Verity had said there would be no religious service. But this man did not look like a priest from the local church. Pastor Withers? No, not him. Verity moved away from the coffin and sat down in the front row. I sat across the aisle from her, trying to focus on the priest's words, but my thoughts kept returning to the farm, to Verity's strange behavior, to the ban on going there. After the official ceremony, when the coffin was taken to the crematorium, people began to disperse. I noticed Verity talking quickly and quietly with a tall, thin man at the exit. His face seemed vaguely familiar to me, perhaps one of the artists Christopher and Verity were rumored to associate with. They exchanged a few words, then the man shook his head sharply, turned and left. Verity looked frightened, angry. It was hard to say for sure, but she certainly didn't look like a widow mourning her beloved husband. I approached her again, not wanting to miss the opportunity to talk. Who was that? I asked without preamble. Just a friend, she said, clearly nervous. I'm sorry, Mr. Higgs, I have to go. At least tell me what Christopher has been doing all these years. My voice trembled, betraying the pain I had been so carefully hiding. What was he doing on the farm? Was he really growing vegetables? Or was he organizing those art workshops for children that people talk about? Verity froze, her shoulders tensing under the black fabric of her dress. He was living his life, she said quietly, a life you never understood or accepted. Please respect his choice, at least after his death. She turned and walked toward the exit, but I couldn't just let her go. You're hiding something, I said, following her. What is there on the farm that I shouldn't see? What was my son doing there? She stopped abruptly and turned around. Her pale face was contorted with sudden rage. You have no right, she almost shouted. The few remaining people turned to look at us. You haven't been interested in his life for 5 years. You've been dead to him for 5 years, and now you demand answers? How hypocritical must my politeness be to answer you? Her voice trembled, tears welling up in her eyes, the first tears I had ever seen on her face. I forbid you to come to the farm. Ever. Do you hear me? Never come there. She almost ran to the exit, leaving me standing in the middle of the half-empty hall, stunned by her outburst. Is she all right? Pastor Withers, the one from the local church, appeared beside me. It turned out he was here after all, just not conducting the ceremony. I don't know, I replied honestly. She just lost her husband. Yes, but... He hesitated. Forgive my tactlessness, Mr. Higgs, but I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. About your son, we've been talking for the last couple of years. He came to church, not for services, just to talk. I looked at the pastor in surprise. Christopher had never been religious. We rarely went to church, even on major holidays. What did you talk about? The pastor sighed. Mostly about forgiveness, about reconciliation. He was very upset about your quarrel. He wanted to find a way to repair the relationship, but he was afraid of facing rejection and condemnation again. The pastor's words hit me like a punch in the gut. Christopher wanted to reconcile. He thought about our quarrel, and I thought he had safely forgotten about me, thrown me out of his new happy life. Why didn't he come to me? I asked, knowing the answer was obvious. Pride. The pastor put his hand on my shoulder. Yours and his. Pride is a terrible thing. It builds walls where there should be bridges. I nodded, unable to speak. My throat tightened with unshed tears. And the farm, I finally managed to say. Do you know what he was doing there? Why does his wife not want me to go there? The pastor frowned and looked away. I haven't been to the farm. Christopher never invited me there. He didn't talk much about his work, only mentioning that he had found his calling, that he was happy. My son was happy in his new life, a life without me. That should have been comforting, but for some reason it only intensified the pain. After the funeral, I tried to find out more about Christopher's life on the farm. I asked mutual acquaintances, neighbors, and even tried to carefully pry something out of his former colleagues. But I was met with a strange silence. No one seemed to know what my son had been doing for the past 5 years, or they didn't want to talk about it. He was growing vegetables, I think, shrugged Tom Reynolds, Christopher's old school friend. Organic and all that. But I wasn't there. We hadn't been in touch much lately. He and his wife were organizing some kind of art events, said Martha Finch, the owner of a local flower shop, uncertainly. My niece took her child there for a master class. But that was 2 years ago, and since then the farm has been closed. They stopped inviting people there. Your boy has found his calling, Alfred, Abigail Loomis said with strange significance when I stopped by her fabric store. Sometimes children need to stray from the beaten path to find themselves. What do you mean? I pressed. What calling? But she just shook her head and looked away. It's not for me to tell you, Alfred. If Verity doesn't want you to know, there might be a reason. It was as if there was a conspiracy of silence surrounding the farm, surrounding my son's life. And the more I asked, the more convinced I became that Verity was hiding something. Something I needed to know. A week after the funeral, I happened to see an advertisement in the local newspaper for the sale of the Prescott farm. Historic farm with 15 acres of land, fully restored 19th century house, several outbuildings, large barn. Ideal for a family or business. Urgent sale, price reduced. Urgent sale, price reduced. Verity was really in a hurry to get rid of the farm. But why? What was there in that old barn where Christopher's body was found? What was his widow hiding from me? I looked at the ad, and a decision grew inside me. A decision that I knew no reasonable person would approve of. But I couldn't help myself. I had to know the truth. I had to see the place where my son had lived and died. The place he had chosen instead of me, instead of the family business. I had to go to the farm, against Verity's wishes, against, perhaps, Christopher's last will. I needed to see with my own eyes what my son had been doing all these years, and maybe finally understand why he left me. I watched the farm for 3 days. I just sat in my old Toyota on a hill half a mile from the house, where I had a great view of the whole area, and looked through my binoculars. I felt like an idiot, a spy from a cheap detective novel. At 72 years old, sitting in ambush, tracking down my own daughter-in-law, I had sunk low. But I had no other way of finding out Verity's daily routine. I had no idea when she left, when she returned, or if there was anyone else on the farm. Fortunately, the first few days of surveillance yielded results. Every morning around 9 o'clock, Verity's black Volvo would drive out of the gate and return only at 5 or 6 in the evening. Where did she go? What did she do all day? Perhaps she met with potential buyers, or with lawyers sorting out the formalities of the inheritance, or... Well, I didn't care. The main thing was that I had about 8 hours to look around the farm. On the 4th day, I made up my mind. I waited until the black Volvo disappeared around the bend, waited another half hour to be sure, and only then drove up to the farm gate. The gate was unlocked. I slowly drove onto the property, feeling my heart pounding. The last time I was here, well, to be honest, I had never been here before. I had only driven by, watching my son from a distance. The driveway wound its way between old oak trees, and then opened up to reveal the main house, a two-story red brick building with white shutters and a spacious porch, a typical late 19th century New England farmhouse, but well-maintained and tastefully restored. The window frames were new, the roof had been replaced, and the porch had been recently painted. I turned off the engine and just sat there for a few minutes, looking at the house. My son had lived here. He spent his days within these walls, eating, sleeping, dreaming, and making plans. Plans that had no place for me. Getting out of the car, I looked around. In addition to the main house, there were several outbuildings on the property. To the right of the house was a small garage, behind it a shed, apparently for tools. To the left was another building, perhaps a summer kitchen or a guest house. And further away, about 100 yards behind the house, stood a massive barn, an old wooden structure with a gabled roof. That was where Christopher's body was found. I moved toward the house feeling like a thief who had illegally entered someone else's property. Technically, that's what I was. The door was locked, and I didn't try to break the lock. After all, there are boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. Besides, I didn't want to rummage through the personal belongings of the son and his wife. I just wanted to understand what he had been doing all these years. Walking around the house, I looked in the windows. The interior looked surprisingly lived in. Not like the sterile houses in magazines, but like a real family home. A cozy living room with a massive fireplace, a soft sofa, and bookshelves reaching the ceiling, a spacious kitchen with an old-fashioned stove, and a long wooden table that could seat 8 people. On the walls were paintings, lots of paintings, mostly abstract, bright, expressive. Works by Verity, I suppose. Not that I know anything about art. In the corner of the living room stood an old piano. Did Christopher play it? He took lessons as a child and was quite good at playing Chopin. But then he gave it up. His studies took up too much time, and later his job at the pharmacy. I turned away from the window, fighting the flood of memories, and headed for the outbuildings. The garage was empty. Verity had taken the only car. In the shed, I found the usual garden tools, a lawnmower, shovels, and rakes. Everything was neatly arranged, everything in its place. My son had always been organized. In the third building, which I took to be a guest house, I found a small studio. It was clearly an artist's studio. An easel, canvases, brushes, paints. There were no works, only blank canvases and jars of pigments. Verity's studio. So she had continued to paint while living here. I went outside and looked at the barn. The large, gloomy building stood apart, as if deliberately separated from the cozy house and the small, neat studio. The wooden walls had darkened with age, but the roof, like the house, had been recently replaced. New window frames, a new door. Clearly, money had been invested in the barn, keeping it in good condition. As I approached the barn, a strange feeling came over me. Not fear, no. More like a premonition. It was as if I was standing on the threshold of something important that would turn my whole perception of my son upside down. The barn door was locked with a massive padlock. I walked around the building, checking the windows, but they were too high. Only small windows under the roof, impossible to reach. Returning to the door, I examined the lock more closely. An ordinary padlock, nothing special. When I was younger, I knew how to pick locks like this. Back when I worked at my father's pharmacy during the summer and constantly lost the keys to the storeroom. But those skills were long forgotten, and I didn't have the right tools. I looked around the area around the barn, looking for anything that might help. Next to the side wall was a pile of scrap metal, old parts from agricultural machinery, some pipes, wire. After rummaging through the pile, I found a suitable piece of wire, bent it into a G shape, and returned to the lock. It took me about 5 minutes to fiddle with it. My fingers wouldn't obey me. The wire kept bending, but finally something clicked and the lock opened. I felt a ridiculous sense of pride, like a schoolboy who had successfully performed a trick. After removing the lock, I pushed the heavy door. It opened with a long creak, letting me into the barn. The first thing I noticed was the smell of paint, turpentine, varnish, wood. Thick, rich, almost tangible. A smell that cannot be confused with anything else. The smell of an artist's studio. I took a step inside, allowing my eyes to adjust to the dim light. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows under the roof, casting slanted stripes on the wooden floor. And in these stripes of light, like visions, like ghosts, outlines appeared. Paintings. Hundreds of paintings. They stood along the walls, lay in stacks, hung on homemade racks, canvases of all sizes, from miniatures to giant canvases as tall as a person. My breath caught in my throat. I stood, unable to move, stunned by the sight. But the paintings were not the only treasure in the barn. In the center of the room, on specially constructed pedestals, stood sculptures. Dozens of sculptures made of wood, metal, and stone. Some were abstract, unrecognizable forms. Others were quite realistic figures of people, animals, and objects. Workstations were located around the perimeter of the barn, a massive table with paints and brushes, a woodworking machine, a welding machine, and a kiln for firing clay. Professional tools, expensive materials, everything a serious artist needs to work. I took a few more steps forward, completely confused. Whose workshop was this? Verity's? But why would she need a second studio, in addition to the one in the guest house? And why so many works? And why were they hidden here, rather than displayed in the house, shown to the public? I moved closer to one of the paintings standing on an easel. It was a landscape, a field golden with ripe wheat, a blue sky with heavy cumulus clouds. But there was something tense about this landscape. It was as if a storm was hidden behind the idyllic view, ready to break out at any moment. There was a signature in the lower right corner of the canvas. I leaned over, peering at the small letters, and felt the ground slip away from under my feet. K. Higgs, Christopher Higgs, my son. I moved on to the next painting, a still life. Bottles, books, apples. A simple subject, but executed with such technique, such a sense of light and shadow, that the object seemed alive, ready to leap out of the frame. The same signature in the corner, and the next painting, and another, and sculptures, and sketches scattered across the tables. All of this was created by my son, Christopher, who at 20 wanted to quit pharmaceuticals and go to art school. Christopher, to whom I said at the time, "Don't be silly. What kind of artist are you? The Higgs are pharmacists, not bohemian idlers." Christopher, who obeyed my will for 15 years, worked in the family business, and then left to become what he always wanted to be, an artist. I sank down onto a wooden stool standing next to one of the tables, stunned by this discovery. My son was talented, incredibly talented. I knew nothing about art, but even I could feel the skill in these works, the depth, the emotion, the technique. And all this time, while I thought he was a failure who had run away from responsibility, he was creating this. But why did he hide his work? Why didn't he exhibit, sell his paintings, talk about his talent? Why was Verity so eager to keep me from finding out about it? Rising on shaky legs, I began to slowly walk around the barn, looking at Christopher's work more closely. And the more I looked, the stronger a strange, disturbing feeling grew inside me. The paintings were beautiful, but there was a sense of pain in them, deep, all-consuming pain. Even in the brightest, seemingly cheerful landscapes, there was a sense of brokenness, and many of the works were downright gloomy. Stormy seas, bare winter trees, ruins of old buildings, images of loneliness, abandonment, loss. I stopped in front of a large canvas hidden behind a stack of other paintings. Something drew me to it, some kind of sixth sense. Carefully pulling it out, I placed the canvas on the nearest easel and froze. I was looking at myself in the painting, but it was not an ordinary portrait. My face on the canvas was distorted. My features were exaggerated to the point of grotesqueness, my eyes sunken with heavy eyelids, my mouth twisted into a contemptuous sneer. I was sitting in my office in the pharmacy, at a massive desk, and behind me stood shelves of medicines resembling prison bars. I couldn't bring myself to call this portrait flattering, but there was a frightening truth in it. This was how my son saw me: cold, harsh, contemptuous. A man who had locked himself in a cage of his own ambitions, his own pride. I turned away, but my gaze immediately fell on another painting, and then another, and another. They were everywhere, works in which I could recognize myself. Sometimes direct portraits, sometimes allegories, sometimes just a figure, a silhouette, a gesture that I recognized as my own. In one painting, I was enlarged to gigantic proportions, crushing a tiny figure with a brush in his hand, obviously Christopher himself. In another, my face was breaking into pieces like a shattered mirror. In the third, I was standing with my back turned, walking away down a road, while a child's figure reached out to me. The subjects varied, but the emotions behind them were constant. Pain, resentment, anger, disappointment, longing. I sank to the floor, unable to stand any longer. I was shaking. There was a lump in my throat that made it hard to breathe. This was how my son saw me. This was how he had felt all these years. This was why he didn't want me to come here, to see his work. These paintings were his confession, his cry, his way of pouring onto the canvas everything he couldn't say to my face. And this was why Verity had forbidden me to come to the farm. She was protecting his legacy, his pain, his truth. But was that the whole truth? Was that the only way he saw me? I raised my head, scanning the barn, trying to find at least one work where I wasn't a monster, a tyrant, a villain, and I found it. In the far corner, almost hidden behind a stack of canvases, stood 3 paintings. I struggled to my feet and walked over to them. The first one showed me as a young man, the way I was when Christopher was about 5 years old. We were sitting on the shore of a lake, fishing rods in our hands, the sun reflecting off the water. I was smiling, looking at my son. It was a light, bright painting, full of warmth and nostalgia. The second one showed me in my first pharmacy, still small, on the corner of Maple and Fifth. I was showing little Christopher how to read a prescription correctly. My face shows concentration, but also pride. Pride in my quick-witted son, who grasps everything so quickly. The third, I am sleeping in a chair by the fireplace, an open book on my lap. The picture is painted in soft, warm tones, full of a kind of aching tenderness. I leaned against the wall, feeling tears running down my cheeks. So not everything was lost. So my son still had bright memories, good moments from our life together. Not just pain and resentment, but love too. Love that I didn't deserve, but that he still felt. Wiping my tears with my sleeve, I continued to explore the barn. At the far end, I discovered a small room, something like an office. There was a desk, a computer, shelves with art books, and folders with documents. On the table lay an open album with sketches. I leafed through it, recognizing the drafts of many paintings I had already seen in the barn. But there were also new ones, apparently ideas for future works that Christopher had not had time to realize. Next to the album lay a stack of letters. I didn't want to read my son's personal correspondence, but the title of the top letter caught my eye: Boston Contemporary Art Gallery. I picked up the letter and scanned it. It was an invitation to Christopher Higgs to hold a solo exhibition at one of New England's most prestigious galleries. We are impressed by the depth and sincerity of your work, a unique view of modernity through the prism of personal trauma. We would be delighted to present your collection, Fathers and Children, to the general public. The letter was dated 2 weeks before Christopher's death. My son had received recognition, real professional recognition of his talent, and he didn't have time to enjoy it. I sank into a chair, feeling bitterness spreading inside me. So many years lost, so many opportunities missed. I could have been there for him, supported him, been proud of him. Instead, I became the source of his pain, the object of his anger, a character in his dark paintings. I sat motionless for a few more minutes, trying to collect my thoughts. Then I slowly got up and began to tidy everything up. I put the letters back in their place, closed the album, and carefully put the paintings I had looked at back where they had been before. As I left the barn, I glanced once more at this remarkable collection, my son's legacy, evidence of a talent I had not allowed to blossom earlier, evidence of the pain I had caused him. I locked the door and put the lock back on. Let my visit remain a secret to Verity, at least for now. Walking to the car, I felt completely drained. It was as if all my energy and emotions had drained out of me, leaving only an empty shell. The son I knew, The neat pharmacist in a white coat, the diligent student, the obedient heir to the family business, was just a mask. The real Christopher had been living here all these years in this barn, pouring his soul, his pain, his vision of the world onto canvas. And I never really knew him. As I got behind the wheel, I thought, what should I do next? Tell Verity about my visit? Demand an explanation as to why she had hidden from everyone, and from me in particular, that my son was a talented artist? Insist that Christopher's works not be sold off with the farm, but preserved and shown to the world? But I didn't know the answers to these questions. I didn't know what to do. I only knew that I would never be the same again. What I saw in the barn turned my whole perception of my son, our life, and myself upside down. As I started the car, I took one last look at the barn, a simple wooden building that held a whole world inside, a world created by my son, a world I was never destined to enter during his lifetime. I couldn't leave. I got in the car, started the engine, even drove a few meters down the driveway, and stopped. I turned off the engine and put the keys back in my pocket. I had to find out more, to see all my son's work, to understand what he was trying to say to the world, to understand who he really was. This man who bore my surname, my blood, but remained a stranger to me. Returning to the barn, I opened the lock again with the same wire. This time it was quicker. My hands already knew what to do. I went inside, closed the door behind me, and looked around with a new feeling. Now that the initial shock had passed, I could examine Christopher's works more closely, evaluate them not only through the prism of our damaged history. The barn was organized like a real studio gallery. Part of the space was occupied by workstations, easels, tables with tools, places for sculpture and ceramics. But most of it was reserved for the exhibition. Paintings hung on the walls or stood on special stands. Sculptures were placed on pedestals of various heights. Everything was neat, well thought out, tasteful. My son inherited my love of order, although he found a different use for it. I began to slowly walk around the room, lingering at each work. Now, looking at them in sequence, I began to see the evolution. The early paintings were fierce, full of anger and pain, sharp brushstrokes, screaming colors, distorted shapes, especially those in which I was depicted. They seemed to spill out all the resentment of years of oppression, of unfulfilled dreams, of rejected feelings. But the further on, the calmer the works became. The colors softened, the lines became smoother. New themes appeared: nature, rural life, portraits of people I didn't know, perhaps neighbors in the area. Even I looked different in the later paintings, still harsh, but no longer so demonic. More humanity, more understanding, more acceptance. Suddenly, my gaze fell on a series of small paintings in the far corner of the barn. They were different from the rest. They were not oil or acrylic, but watercolors. Light, airy, full of light. They depicted a young woman with short dark hair and a boy of about 7 or 8. They were walking in the park, sitting by the lake, reading a book under a tree. Looking closer, I recognized the woman. Verity, but not the Verity I knew. Cold, haughty, reserved. In these watercolors, she was smiling, her face soft and open. And the boy, he had dark hair like Verity, but his eyes, I would recognize those eyes anywhere. They were the same as Christopher's, the same as Helena's, the same as mine. Did Christopher and Verity have a son? I shook my head, dismissing the thought. No, impossible. I would have known. Medford is a small town. Rumors spread quickly. Someone would have told me if my son had a child. Maybe it was just my imagination, a dream of a child they never had. Or I shuddered when I noticed a small inscription in the corner of one of the watercolors. Verity and Milo, summer of 2023. Last summer. So the boy was real. But where was he now? Why wasn't he at the funeral? And why the hell didn't anyone tell me I had a grandson? However, the answer was obvious, because I didn't deserve to know. Because I stopped being part of my son's life 5 years ago. Because I slammed that door myself and threw away the key. Turning away from the watercolors, feeling a lump rising in my throat, I noticed a small cabinet in the corner of the studio. Coming closer, I saw that it contained folders with sketches, drafts, photographs, probably references for paintings, and books. Lots of books about art, albums of famous artists, exhibition catalogs, and also a stack of identical black notebooks with hard covers. I took the top one and opened it to a random page. It was a diary. Christopher's handwriting was neat, slightly slanted to the right, so familiar. I had seen it thousands of times on prescriptions, reports, and greeting cards, but never in personal notes. March 14, 2022. Today I started a new painting from the series Fathers and Children. I'm not sure it will make it into the main exhibition. It's too personal, too painful. But I need to paint it. For myself. For my healing. I still see him in my dreams. I still hear his voice saying the same words. If you cross this threshold, you may not return. But in my dreams I don't leave. I stay. And I say everything I wanted to say then. I say that I hate pharmacies. I hate the smell of medicine. I hate endless conversations about profits and losses. I say that I am suffocating in a white coat, that I am slowly dying, locked in a cage of his expectations. And then I wake up and realize that I never told him the truth. I just left, like a coward, like a child who was afraid of parental disapproval even at 38. Verity says I should call him, invite him to the farm, show him my work, tell him about Milo. She says he has a right to know he has a grandson, that he's not the monster I make him out to be. Maybe she's right. Maybe all these years I've been trying to justify my departure by painting my father as worse than he really is, demonizing him so I don't feel guilty. But then I remember his face, his voice, his unyielding nature. Higgs are pharmacists, not bohemian idlers. Art is frivolous, a pastime for those with too much money and too little brains. Do you really think anyone wants your daubs? And I realize I'm not ready to hear those words again. Not ready to see the contempt in his eyes when he sees what I've devoted my life to. Not ready to let him poison the only pure, real thing I have. I closed the diary, feeling my hands tremble. Tears clouded my eyes, and I wiped them with my jacket sleeve, not caring about propriety. My son, my boy. So much pain, so much misunderstanding, so many unspoken words between us. And now it's too late. Too late for reconciliation, for explanations, for new beginnings. All that remains are these diaries, these paintings, messages from a world I can no longer enter. I picked up the next notebook and opened it. Entries for the year 2021. I flipped through a few pages. April 20th, 2021. I drove past my father's main pharmacy today. I didn't go in, of course. I just drove by. I saw his silhouette in the office window. He still works late, still alone. People in town say he hardly ever leaves the pharmacy, except to go home to sleep. I wonder if he's happy there, in his kingdom of pills and potions? Or does he just not know any other life? Sometimes I hate him for that, for never seeing the real me, for forcing me to be someone else for 15 years. But more often, I just miss him. I miss the father who read me books before bed, who taught me how to ride a bike, who cried at my mother's funeral, holding my hand so tightly as if he was afraid I would disappear too. The sound of a car pulling up snapped me out of my stupor. I jumped up, ran to the crack in the boards, and looked outside. Verity's black Volvo was pulling into the farm. She was back earlier than usual. I had to leave immediately. But it was too late. I wouldn't have time to get out of the barn, reach my car, and drive away unnoticed. Looking around frantically, I began to put the diaries back in their place, trying not to leave any traces of my presence. My hands were shaking. My breathing was uneven. I felt like a thief caught in the act. And in a sense, that's what I was. I had stolen something that didn't belong to me. My son's private life, his secret thoughts, his hidden pain. After putting the diaries back in the cupboard, I looked around for a place to hide. But the barn was too open, too empty for good hiding places. All I could do was hope that Verity wouldn't come here. But footsteps were already approaching the barn door. Firm, confident footsteps of someone who knows where they are going. The click of a lock. The creak of a door opening. I froze in the middle of the room as if paralyzed. There was no point in hiding, no point in pretending. She would see me, and then the door swung open, letting in light and Verity's silhouette against it. She took a step inside, not yet noticing me in the dim light. Then she froze, instinctively sensing a stranger's presence. "Who's there?" Her voice was firm, without the slightest hint of fear. I cleared my throat, stepping out of the shadows. "It's me, Verity. Alfred." She stared at me as if she had seen a ghost. So many emotions flashed through her gray eyes in an instant. Shock, anger, fear, pain. Then her face froze, turning into a cold, impenetrable mask. "I asked you never to come here." Her voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "I had to see." I spread my arms, gesturing toward the barn, the paintings, the sculptures. "I had to find out what my son had been doing all these years." "And did you find out?" Bitterness crept into her tone. "Did you enjoy the show? Did you laugh at his daubings?" "Verity, I faltered, not knowing how to express what I was feeling. I had no idea about his talent, about his pain, about Milo. She flinched at the mention of the boy's name. "You rummaged through his diaries," she said, not as a question but as a statement. "Yes," I said. There was no point in denying the obvious. "And I apologize for this invasion of your privacy, but I can't say I regret it. I had to know the truth." "The truth," she said with a bitter smile. "And what is the truth, Mr. Higgs? That your son was talented? That he could have been a great artist if you hadn't forced him to sell drugs for 15 years? Or that he loved you despite everything and dreamed of a reconciliation that never happened?" Each of her words was like a knife stab. I staggered, feeling my legs buckle. "Sit down," she nodded toward a chair at the table. "You look like you're about to fall." I obediently sat down, feeling a strange gratitude for the gesture. Verity remained standing, her arms crossed over her chest, alert like a wild animal ready to flee at any moment. "Where's Milo?" I asked, surprised at how calm my voice sounded, when inside I was screaming with pain and loss. "At my sister's in Boston," she replied after a long pause. "It was hard for him here after Christopher died. I sent him there for a while, until I settle everything with the sale of the farm." "Does he know that I'm his grandfather?" Verity nodded. "Christopher told him about you. He showed him photos. Milo, he wanted to meet you." "And now?" My voice trembled. "Now do I have a chance to see him?" She looked at me for a long time, as if trying to decide something. Then she slowly shook her head. "I don't know, Mr. Higgs. Honestly, I don't know. Everything is so complicated right now. Milo just lost his father. He's scared, confused. I'm not sure that meeting a grandfather who hasn't spoken to his dad in 5 years is what he needs right now." I nodded, feeling the pain but understanding her logic. She was protecting the child, and I couldn't blame her for that. "What about the paintings?" I asked, changing the subject. "What are you going to do with them?" Verity took a deep breath and walked over to one of the canvases, the one where I was depicted in my office, sitting at my desk, my features distorted. "Do you know why he didn't want you to see his work?" she asked, looking at the painting, not at me. "Was he afraid I would laugh at them? That I would criticize them?" "No," she shook her head. "I mean, yes, partly. But mainly he didn't want you to see his pain, his anger, his hatred." She turned to me, tears welling in her eyes. "These paintings, especially the early ones, were his therapy, his way of healing. He poured everything he couldn't say to your face onto the canvas. All the feelings that had suffocated him for 15 years while he pretended to be someone he wasn't to please you." I was silent, unable to respond. I already understood all this from looking at his son's work. But hearing it from Verity, from someone who knew him better than I ever did, was painful. "When we met," she continued, sitting down on the edge of the table, "Christopher was like a taut string, always impeccably dressed, always polite, always proper. But in his eyes there was such longing, such despair. I fell in love with those eyes, with the soul that cried out for freedom." She smiled at the memory, and I suddenly saw in her the girl from the watercolors, soft, gentle, full of life. I didn't know then that he painted. I found out by accident. I walked into his apartment when he thought I was at work, and I saw the canvas on the easel, a landscape, the very lake where you and he used to fish when he was a child. "Lake Kedrovoy," I whispered, remembering. "We went there every summer while Helena was alive." "Yes," Verity nodded. He told me a lot about it. How you taught him to cast a line, how you showed him different kinds of fish, how you cooked fish soup on the shore. I closed my eyes, feeling tears welling up in my throat. Those summer days now seemed so distant, so unreal, as if from another life. When I found out about his talent, Verity continued, I convinced him to show me his other works. There were many, dozens, hundreds, hidden in the closet, under the bed, in the attic. He had been painting his whole life, secretly from you, since he was 16, when you ridiculed his first painting. I didn't laugh at it, I tried to object. I just said that if he was going to spend his time on such things, he might as well draw something real, she finished for me. He remembered it word for word, Mr. Higgs. Every word you said, every look, every gesture of disapproval. I lowered my head. Yes, I said something like that. Not out of malice, not out of a desire to hurt him, just out of a lack of understanding, not seeing the value in what was important to him. After I saw his work, Verity continued, I tried to convince him to show it to the world, to send them to galleries, to competitions, but he refused. He said he painted for himself, not for the public, but I could see that wasn't the reason. He was afraid of rejection, afraid of confirming your opinion that his hobby was pointless. She stood up, walked over to the cupboard, and took out a folder with documents. It was only after we bought the farm and moved here that he finally began to paint freely, without fear, without worrying about what others would say. There was an empty barn here, the perfect studio. His best works were born here. Here he began to create sculptures. Here he finally became the artist he always wanted to be. She opened the folder and took out a document. A year ago, I secretly sent photos of his work to several galleries, just to find out if it was worth fighting for, whether the world would be interested in what my husband created. She handed me the document. I took it with trembling hands. It was a letter on Boston Contemporary Art Gallery letterhead. They were interested, Verity said, especially in the Fathers and Sons series. They said his work was profound, emotional, technically perfect. They invited him to a solo exhibition. I scanned the letter. Dear Mr. Higgs, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected to participate in our New Voices of New England program. Your series, Fathers and Sons, has demonstrated outstanding talent and a deep understanding of the complexity of family relationships. We would be delighted to present your solo exhibition at our gallery from September 1st to 30, 2025. He received this letter 2 weeks before his death, Verity said. At first, he didn't believe it. He thought I had forged it to cheer him up. Then he called the gallery and spoke to the curator. Only then did he believe it. She smiled through her tears. You should have seen his face at that moment, Mr. Higgs. So amazed, so happy, as if he had been waiting his whole life for this confirmation that his art was worth something, that he himself was worth something. I lowered the letter to my lap, feeling tears roll down my cheeks. My son had received the recognition he had dreamed of, and I didn't even know about it. That evening, Verity continued, he said he wanted to call you, to tell you about the exhibition, to invite you. He said that now that he had proof of his success, he wasn't afraid to meet you face to face. She shook her head. I talked him out of it. I said he needed to prepare for the exhibition first, select the works, and then invite you. The truth is, I was afraid. I was afraid that you would hurt him again, devalue his success, his talent, that he would retreat back into the shell he had struggled so long to break out of. And that was the right thing to do, I said quietly. I wouldn't have understood then. I needed to see his work to realize. Yes, she nodded, but now it's too late. He died without ever making peace with you, without ever showing you his world, Then Verity got up and went to the window. I'm going to sell the farm, she said, looking at the green fields beyond the barn. Too many memories, too much pain. Milo can't live here. He sees his father everywhere, feels his absence everywhere. I nodded, not trusting my voice. And the money from the sale, part of it will go toward organizing that exhibition in Boston, the one Christopher will never see. But it will be his monument, proof that he was talented, that he chose his path for a reason. She turned to me. I thought long and hard about which works to show. I chose the brightest, the most healed ones, the ones with more love than pain, more acceptance than anger, the ones that show his path to peace with himself, with the past. Including the ones with me in them? I asked, already knowing the answer. No, she shook her head. Not the ones where you're depicted, like that. Those were his nightmares, his demons, not what should represent his legacy to the world. I nodded, understanding her decision, but feeling a strange bitterness. So the world would never know the whole truth about Christopher Higg, about his pain, his struggle, his hatred for his father, which was part of his creativity, his soul. Verity seemed to read my thoughts. That doesn't mean those paintings will be destroyed, she said more softly. They will remain. For Milo, when he grows up, when he's ready, I'll show him all of his father's work. So he knows the whole truth about Christopher's talent and his pain. Something in her voice, in her gaze, had changed. It was as if she had come to some decision. I lied to you at the funeral, she said suddenly. Christopher never said he didn't want you to come to the farm. On the contrary, in recent months, he often talked about reconciliation, about wanting to invite you, show you his work, introduce you to Milo. I looked up, not believing my ears. Then why? Because I was angry, she replied simply. Angry at you for missing the chance to get to know your son. For the fact that because of your pride, your stubbornness, he suffered all these years. For the fact that he died with this unhealed wound in his heart. She sighed. And I was afraid that you would come here and ruin everything again. That you would condemn his choices, ridicule his work, destroy the fragile peace he had finally found here on the farm with us. I lowered my eyes. I couldn't blame her for feeling that way. She loved my son, protected him even after his death. She did what I should have done all these years. But now that you're here, now that you've seen his work, read his diaries, she paused, I think Christopher would want you to know the truth, the whole truth, about his art, about his life, about his son, your grandson. She walked over to the table and took an envelope out of a drawer. This is an invitation to an exhibition. It opens in 3 months in Boston. I would like you to come. Not for me, not for yourself, for Christopher, for his memory. I took the envelope with trembling hands. What about Milo? I asked, afraid to hope. Will he be there? Verity paused as if weighing the pros and cons. Yes, she finally said. He'll be there. And, if you want, you can meet him. I'll tell him you're his grandfather, that you want to be part of his life. I don't deserve that, I whispered. Maybe, she agreed. But Milo deserves to know his family, his whole family, even the part that didn't always do the right thing. She glanced at her watch. I have to go. I have a meeting with the realtor in an hour. And Mr. Higgs, I'd prefer it if you didn't come to the farm unannounced anymore. Not because I want to hide anything, but because I need time, space, the opportunity to say goodbye to this place in my own way. I got up, feeling strangely empty and at the same time renewed, as if after a long, painful illness. I understand, I said, and thank you for the truth, for the opportunity to see Christopher's work, for the chance to meet Milo. Don't thank me, Verity shook her head. I'm not doing this for you, for your son, and for your grandson. I nodded, understanding. She still hadn't forgiven me. Perhaps she never would. But she was taking a step toward reconciliation, for Christopher's sake, for his memory, for his son's future. And that was more than I deserved. See you at the exhibition, Verity said, opening the barn door and letting me out into the bright sunshine. See you then, I replied, carefully tucking the invitation into the inside pocket of my jacket, close to my heart. Walking to my car, I knew I would never be the same again. What I had seen in the barn and heard from Verity had changed me forever. It showed me the full depth of my mistakes, the full weight of my guilt. But it also gave me hope, hope that all was not lost. That in Milo's face, in Christopher's legacy, in my memory of him, I could still find a path to redemption. The Boston Museum of Modern Art was located in an old industrial building that had been converted into an exhibition space. High ceilings, brick walls, large windows, All this created a feeling of spaciousness and at the same time intimacy, ideal for exhibiting Christopher's works. I stood at the entrance clutching my invitation ticket. People bustled around me, fashionably dressed young couples, serious art connoisseurs with catalogs, art school students with sketchbooks. They had all come to see my son's work that I myself had only seen after his death. 3 months had passed since that day in the barn. 3 months of inner struggle, reevaluation, and painful reflections on a past that could no longer be changed. I hardly left the house, spending my days in an armchair by the fireplace, looking through old photographs, remembering, analyzing, regretting. Several times I was tempted to call Verity to find out about Milo, to ask about the preparations for the exhibition. But each time I stopped myself. She had made it clear that she needed space and time. I had to respect that, just as I had never respected Christopher's wishes and needs. And now here I was, standing at the entrance to the gallery, in a new suit bought especially for the occasion, with thinning, carefully combed gray hair and hands shaking with excitement. Was I ready to see my son's work on public display? Was I ready to meet Verity and Milo? Was I ready to hear comments, criticism, and praise of Christopher's art from strangers who had never known him in life? Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward toward the glass doors of the gallery. Inside, it was bright and spacious. White walls, wooden floors, spotlights directed at each painting. Christopher's works, carefully selected by Verity, hung in strict order, by thematic groups, in chronological sequence. The first room was devoted to his early works. Landscapes, still lifes, portraits. Technical but not yet fully mature, they already demonstrated undoubted talent and a special vision of the world. Next to each painting hung a small plaque with the title, Year of Creation, and a comment from the curator. I moved slowly from work to work, absorbing every detail, every brushstroke, every shade. Other visitors walked around me, talking quietly, sometimes stopping in front of a painting that particularly impressed them. "What depth of color," said a gray-haired man to his companion, looking at a landscape with a lake. The very lake where Christopher and I fished every summer. "Look how he captured the reflection in the water. Amazing. And this play of light and shadow," echoed the woman. "It's as if a storm is about to break, but the sun is still shining. Such tension." I moved from painting to painting, trying to be inconspicuous, just one of many visitors. But inside me a strange feeling was growing, a mixture of pride and bitterness, admiration and regret. Here is a still life with pharmacy bottles, everyday objects from my daily life, transformed by Christopher's brush into something almost mystical, mysterious, beautiful. Here was a portrait of an elderly woman, Mrs. Pratt, our neighbor who had died 10 years ago. I never knew Christopher had painted her. Here was a cityscape, Medford's main street on a rainy evening, streetlights reflecting in puddles, passers-by hurrying under their umbrellas. Each painting was a window into my son's soul, into his perception of the world, into those aspects of his personality that I never got to know during his lifetime. The second room was dedicated to the Country Life series, works created by Christopher while he was already on the farm. Here were images of fields, forests, old barns, farmhouses. More technically mature and more confident in their composition, these paintings radiated a kind of inner calm and harmony. It was as if, by moving to the farm and away from my influence, Christopher had finally found his peace, his place in the world. "A striking evolution," said the young man with the notebook to his companion. "See how his palette has changed? How the nervousness of the brushstrokes has disappeared? It's as if the artist has finally exhaled, straightened his shoulders." "Yes, and his technique has become more confident," nodded the other. "Although I must admit, there was a kind of wild energy in his early works that is no longer there." I wanted to tell them that this wild energy was born of pain, anger, and suppressed feelings, that the calmness of his later works was the result not only of artistic maturity, but also of emotional healing, that each of these paintings was a stage in my son's life journey, a journey that I had refused to see and accept for so long. But I remained silent. I wasn't here to explain, justify, or share. I was here to learn, to look, to understand, to say goodbye. In the third room hung portraits. Verity, Milo, neighbors, random passers-by who had struck Christopher's imagination. They were surprisingly vivid, expressive, and psychologically profound, especially the portraits of Milo, a boy I had never seen in person, but in whose features I recognized familiar lines, in whose eyes I saw reflections of my son's eyes, my late wife's eyes, my own eyes. In one of the paintings, Milo was sitting on the porch of a farmhouse, his arms wrapped around his knees, gazing into the distance with a thoughtful expression that was not childlike. A ray of sunlight fell on his face, highlighting his cheekbones and giving his eyes an almost unearthly glow. Next to him on the step lay a book, Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, one of Christopher's favorite books as a child. I stood in front of this painting the longest, unable to tear myself away from the boy's face, which combined the features of 3 generations of Higgses. My grandson, whom I may never truly know. "This is the most powerful portrait in the series," said someone next to me. I turned and saw a tall, thin man with a neatly trimmed beard and intelligent eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. "Do you agree?" he asked, noticing my gaze. "Yes," I replied hoarsely. "Very expressive." "He's the artist's son," said the man. "I'm the curator of the exhibition, Jeffrey Payne. Christopher Higgs and I had been corresponding for several months before his tragic death. I was impressed by his work, especially his portraits." You knew my son." I stopped, but it was too late. The curator looked at me intently. "Are you Christopher's father, Mr. Higgs?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Very pleased to meet you," he said, extending his hand. "Christopher wrote a lot about you in his letters." "I'm afraid to ask in what context," I tried to joke, but the joke came out bitter. The curator smiled knowingly. "In various ways, but in his last letter, shortly before his death, he mentioned that he would like to invite you to the opening of the exhibition. He wanted you to see his success." I turned away, fighting back tears. Christopher wanted me to be here. He wanted me to share in his triumph, for me to finally see and accept the part of his life that I had denied for so long. "It's a shame that didn't happen while he was alive," the curator said quietly. "But I'm glad you're here today. It means a lot to his legacy." He nodded to me and walked away, leaving me alone with the portrait of his grandson in my heavy thoughts. I continued my tour, moving on to the 4th and final room of the exhibition. Here were Christopher's latest works, a series of abstract paintings collectively titled Reconciliation. Bright, light, full of movement and life, they were strikingly different from anything I had seen before. They lacked the pain of his early works, the calm contemplation of country life, and the psychological depth of his portraits. They had joy, pure, unclouded joy of creativity. In the last months of his life, Christopher Higgs experimented with abstraction, read the explanatory plaque on the wall. The Reconciliation series became his artistic legacy, an expression of his newfound inner harmony, acceptance of the past and openness to the future. I stood in front of these paintings feeling a strange sense of calm. So at the end of his life, my son had found peace in his soul after all. He had reconciled with the past, perhaps even with me, at least in his heart, if not in reality. Suddenly, I noticed a familiar figure in the far corner of the hall. Verity was standing in front of the last painting in the series, a large canvas filled with splashes of red, gold, and blue. Next to her stood a boy of about 8, with dark hair and so familiar eyes. Milo, my grandson. I froze, not knowing what to do. Approach, speak, or respect Verity's desire to keep her distance, but the decision was made for me. Milo turned and noticed me. He tugged at Verity's sleeve and whispered something in her ear. She looked up and met my gaze. Her face remained impassive, but there was a flicker in her eyes. Recognition, wariness, perhaps even pity. She leaned toward her son and whispered something to him. The boy nodded and, to my surprise, walked straight toward me. "Are you Mr. Higgs?" he asked, stopping a few steps away. "Grandpa Alfred?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I'm Milo," he said simply. "Mom says you're Dad's father." "Yes," I managed. "I'm your grandfather, Milo." He looked at me with childlike candor, making no attempt to hide his curiosity. "You have the same eyes as Dad," he remarked. "And me too. Mom says it's a Higgs family trait." "Your mom is right," I tried to smile. "Your grandmother Helena had the same eyes. And my father. And his father." Milo nodded, as if confirming a fact he already knew. "Do you like Dad's paintings?" he asked. "Very much," I replied honestly. "Your dad was very talented. I didn't always understand that. But now I see it." The boy nodded again, seriously and maturely. "Dad said you don't really like art, that you're a pharmacist and wanted him to be a pharmacist too." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Your dad is right. I was I wasn't a very good father, Milo. I didn't understand what was important to him. I didn't know how to listen. I didn't know how to accept his choices." Milo thought for a moment, as if pondering my words. "Dad still loved you," he said finally. "He had a picture of you. He showed it to me and told me how you used to go fishing when he was little, how you taught him to ride a bike." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. Christopher remembered the good times. He remembered when I was just a loving father, without high expectations or strict demands, when we were a family. "Mom says it's time for me to go," Milo said, glancing back at Verity, who was now standing at the exit of the hall. "We have a flight tonight. We're moving to Boston for good. Mom will be working at the gallery." "I see," I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment. So they were leaving. The farm was sold, the house in Medford was sold. A new life, far away from me, from memories, from the past. "It was nice to meet you, Grandpa," Milo said with the same childlike directness. "Maybe we'll see each other again someday." "I'd really like that," I replied sincerely. The boy smiled, a smile so reminiscent of Christopher's childhood smile, and ran to his mother. Verity met my gaze over her son's head. There was no warmth or forgiveness in her eyes, but there was a kind of peace, acceptance of what had happened, of who I was, of who Christopher was, that we had all done the best we could, with all our flaws, mistakes, and weaknesses. She nodded slightly to me, not in friendship, but in recognition. Recognition of my right to be here, to see her son's work, to meet my grandson. Then she took Milo by the hand and led him away, disappearing around the corner of the gallery. I was left alone in front of the last painting in the Reconciliation series, an abstract canvas full of light and color, without specific forms, but with a sense of movement, flow, life. "A New Beginning," read the sign next to it. The last completed work by Christopher Higgs, painted a week before his death. A new beginning that was not meant to be in his lifetime. A reconciliation that we never achieved. A conversation that never took place. I stood in front of the painting, oblivious to the passage of time, oblivious to the other visitors passing by. In this bright, light canvas, in this explosion of color and movement, I felt my son's presence more strongly than anywhere else. It was as if he were speaking to me, across time, across space, across death. "I have forgiven you. Forgive yourself." But could I? Did I have the right? Leaving the gallery an hour later, I stood on the sidewalk, not knowing where to go. It was getting dark, the streetlights were coming on, and passers-by were hurrying about their business. A normal day in Boston, for everyone except me. I thought about my big empty house in Medford, waiting for my return, about the chain of pharmacies I had finally sold to Silas Pettigrew, freeing myself from the work of a lifetime that had ultimately become a meaningless burden, about the fact that only empty days filled with memories and regrets lay ahead. But I also thought about Milo, about the boy with Higgs's eyes who knew more good than bad about his grandfather, thanks to Christopher, who, despite everything, kept his love for his father in his heart, about the possibility, however remote, of one day becoming a real grandfather to this child, about the fact that maybe all was not lost, that perhaps some form of redemption did exist after all. And I thought about the paintings, about the 100 paintings now hanging in the gallery, about the hundreds of others left in the barn on the sold farm, about the fact that my son left behind more than I ever created with all my practicality, my business, my clear plans for life. He left beauty, he left emotions, he left a piece of his soul frozen in paint now accessible to anyone who is able to see and feel. I was proud of him, proud and endlessly, unbearably sad that I realized it too late. I slowly wandered to the taxi stand. Tomorrow I will return to Medford, to my empty house, to my empty life, and I will go on living as best I can, with new knowledge, with new pain, with new, albeit faint, hope. And maybe someday I will truly be able to forgive myself, as Christopher seems to have forgiven me, through his art, through his last painting, through his son, through what he told me about our former life, about the times when we were just father and son, without the burden of expectations, disappointments, and unfulfilled hopes. Maybe, someday, but not today. Today I am just an old man who lost his son and found him again, in his paintings, in his boy, in his legacy, only to lose him completely, forever.